Right, hi all. As just said, I'm Katie, and today I'm going to be talking to you about the impact I believe that looking into how sensory rooms can be used to, virtual reality can be used to emulate sensory rooms, how that can have an impact to help adults who have autism. So the way that this talk is going to go is I'm going to start with an explanation of sensory processing, because I believe that knowing that is important for you to be able to understand everything that I'm going to be talking about. Then I'm going to talk more about what sensory rooms are and give a brief overview of that. Then looking to tell you all about how sensory rooms can be emulated in virtual reality and explain the advantages of doing so. So let's get started. If I get this right, yep. So, what are sensors? Well, it's obvious, right? It's the way that you input things about the world. It's the way that you touch things, you see things, you hear things. But why does this matter? What is sensory processing? So the idea is that in your life, you see things and sometimes things are a bit loud, or sometimes things are a bit bright, or sometimes things are too quiet, or they're not bright enough. And so the idea is that that's sensory input. Everything that you take in through your senses is sensory input. And for people who have autism or other similar conditions, sometimes stimuli which for people who don't have those conditions would be completely fine can either be too overstimulating for them or not stimulating enough. So as you see here, I've got up Dunn's model. Dunn's model is the model for understanding sensory processing, and the idea is that there's two scales. There's the hypersensitivity to hyposensitivity scale and the self-regulation scale. So the hypersensitivity scale is about how they react to sensory input. So if you're hypersensitive, then sensory input affects you more than someone who doesn't have the condition would. And if you're hyposensitive, the sensory input affects you far less than other people. Meanwhile, the active versus passive self-regulation is the idea that if you self-regulate actively, you go out and you fix the problem yourself. Whereas passive means you're more likely to sit there and tolerate the fact that you are getting way too much or way too little sensory input. Based off that scale, there's 4 categories that people end up in. So starting in the hypersensitive half, we've got sensory sensitive. That's the kid who is sitting there feeling really uncomfortable, but they can't tell you because they are too overwhelmed. It is the idea that they are passive, so they won't actively do anything to help with the problem, but they are experiencing sensory overload. And then you've got your sensory avoidant. This is because stereotypes of people with autism tend to be quite negative, this is the one who's seen as lashing out because they are overwhelmed. There is too much input and they are struggling and they respond to it, which is often seen as a negative behaviour in society. And then you've got the two in the hyposensitive. There's low registration, which means they genuinely can't hear you. They genuinely can't see it. They do not perceive the sensory input because there is not enough for them to perceive it, and so they just don't notice that it's there. And then sensory seeking, which is the one that's about, this is the one where you have the people who really like weighted blankets or bright lights or loud music. In my research, I chose to focus on sensory seeking because basically I want to be ethical in my research. I don't want to cause someone to have sensory overload. And when you're researching senses, that means that with the way that sensory rooms are, that meant that it was safest to focus on sensory seeking behaviours and symptoms, because then I can most easily target them without the risk of causing them mental harm. So what are sensory rooms? There's one. It's a nice one. I found it on the internet. So they are spaces that are designed to meet sensory needs. So for people who are on the hypersensitive end of the scale, this means that they are a space where they can control their sensory input. They can decide whether the lights are on or off. They can decide how much is touching them, how loud it is. For people who are hyposensitive, This means a space where everything can be loud, everything can be bright, everything can meet their needs because they can have a space that is for them to have things at the levels that they want it. So these are particularly used for people with autism as a form of relaxation and as therapy. Sensory therapy being that basically the idea that you can get used to is the wrong term, but it's the one I'm going to use anyway. Get used to sensory input by basically slowly increasing the amount that you have or slowly decreasing the amount you have in a controlled space. But also it's just a place of relaxation. It's a place where you can go to de-stress because the environment is designed for you. So, application to virtual reality. I like to think that everyone here knows what a VR headset is. Let's assume that. So the way that I'm doing it is basically that you can make virtual reality video games in Unity. Or you can make virtual reality other things in Unity, which is what I'm doing. I am basically planning on, I am building the room right now, so I haven't got any pictures here for you. I am building the room, and the plan is build the room, and then do pre-post testing, which is basically you give them a questionnaire before and you give a questionnaire afterwards, and see whether that reduces the anxiety of the person in question. And then I plan to do a longer term study where you basically do that every week for a few weeks to see how that has an effect on the long-term reduction of anxiety, and I believe it will. I genuinely believe that if you develop a program to give people the space to meet their sensory needs, that's going to reduce their anxiety in the long term. So yeah, that's my hopeful outcomes. So, how is this applicable? Well, understanding of sensory processing in virtual reality. Virtual reality seems to be sticking around, hopefully. People keep talking about, oh, the metaverse is going to change everything. I'm not sure I believe that, but companies believe that, so here we are. So I believe it's genuinely important to understand how sensory processing works in virtual reality, partly because people with autism and similar conditions deserve to use the same tools as everyone else, and so they need to have their needs considered when developing things in the metaverse. And also because, honestly, sensory processing doesn't just affect people with conditions like autism, it affects everyone. You've been in a room that's so loud that you can't think. So understanding how sensory processing works in virtual reality means creating better environments in virtual reality. Also, sensory computation. It's not really a thing, I want to make it a thing. But also public use of virtual reality sensory rooms. So I obviously looked at the literature into virtual reality for autism when starting my degree, and a lot of the virtual reality use is for skills development, which is great. Skills are good. The fact that it was the only research out there, though, was something that got me concerned. Because, it shows an emphasis on the idea that people with conditions like autism need to fit into society, whereas I wanted to do some research into how we can make it so that virtual reality can be used to make people with autism's lives better. So, why virtual reality sensory rooms? Why is this a needed thing? So, on average, it takes about 2 years to be diagnosed with autism, and when you are diagnosed with autism, according to Jones et al. Of 2014, 41.9% of people don't get any sort of help. I've also got some other statistics. 28.1% of people with autism have moderate anxiety. 28.9% have severe anxiety. Of those, 28.9% get any help for their anxiety, whereas 28.1% want help for their anxiety. We have just gone through a pandemic where sensory rooms, you could not access them because we couldn't. We were in lockdown, we had to stay at home. Virtual reality sensory rooms means wider access to sensory rooms, which means that they can be put in places that do not have the room to make a designated room for sensory rooms. And thus, I think it is valuable to show that it is possible to have effective sensory rooms using virtual reality in order to ensure that we can widen access to sensory therapy. In addition, sure, virtual reality headset is expensive. It's about £200 and then the cost of the software. It costs thousands of pounds to build a sensory room. I've been doing my market research. Sometimes they can go up to tens of thousands of pounds. That is not viable in a lot of situations where people need sensory rooms. So having this solution, even if it's not as good of a solution, even if it's not the perfect solution, means that it's not comparing having a VR headset to having a real sensory room. It's comparing having VR sensory therapy to having nothing. And also, headsets are multifunctional, which means that you can justify buying it for a school because it can also be used for teaching opportunities. It means that you can justify having it in your home because when it's not being used for sensory reasons, it's being used as a video game console. So yeah, that's why I think what I'm researching is important, and that's why I hope that my research succeeds. So yeah, conclusion. I've explained to you what sensory processing is and what's it about. I've explained what sensory rooms are. I've explained how sensory rooms can be emulated in VR, and I'm currently working on doing so. And I'm explaining why I think it is important to do so, and why I think that it matters that we use virtual reality, not just for video games, but also as a tool for therapy. Thank you.